The blood had been pooling beneath her for nearly an hour when Cade Mallory finally looked up from the hay. He had been stacking, and saw Patricia Coleman collapsed near the water trough, her calico dress darkening with crimson that spread like a terrible bloom across the dusty ground of his ranch yard in Challis, Idaho, on that scorching August afternoon in 1882. He ran to her with his heart hammering against his ribs, dropping to his knees beside her still form, and gently turning her over to find her face pale as death itself, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. Blood soaked the lower half of her dress, and he knew immediately that whatever had happened to her was far beyond his ability to remedy with bandages and whiskey. She needed a real doctor, and the only one within 50 miles was Doc Harrison in Salmon City, a town that sat more than 30 miles north through mountain passes and rough terrain that would take a wagon far too long to traverse. Patricia had come to his ranch 3 months ago as a widow seeking work, her husband having died in a mining accident near Silver City the previous winter. She had been desperate for employment, and Cade had been in need of someone who could cook decent meals and keep the small ranch house from falling into complete disorder, while he tended to the horses and cattle that comprised his livelihood. She had proven herself capable and hardworking, never complaining about the isolation or the hard labor that came with ranch life in the Idaho territory. But more than that, she had brought something to his lonely existence that he had not realized he had been missing until she arrived with her quiet smile and her gentle manner of speaking that made even the most mundane conversation feel like a gift. He had fallen in love with her slowly, the way a man falls into deep water without realizing how far from shore he has drifted until he looks back and sees the distance he has traveled. Every morning when he came in from the barn to find breakfast waiting, and her face lit by the early sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, he felt his heart constrict with a longing so powerful it frightened him. Every evening when they sat on the porch after supper and watched the mountains turn purple in the fading light, he wanted to tell her what she meant to him, but fear kept his words trapped behind his teeth. She was a widow still mourning her husband, and he was just a rancher with rough hands and rougher manners, who had no right to impose his feelings on a woman who had already suffered enough loss. Now she lay dying in his arms, and all those unsaid words felt like stones in his chest, crushing the breath from his lungs as he carefully lifted her and carried her into the house. He laid her on her bed in the small room off the kitchen that she had made her own, and he pressed clean towels against the source of the bleeding, but they soaked through almost immediately. He did not know what had caused this hemorrhaging, whether she had been injured somehow, or if this was some internal ailment that had suddenly manifested, but he knew with absolute certainty that if he did not get her to a doctor within hours, she would die. The problem was transportation. His wagon was sturdy but slow, pulled by draft horses that were built for power rather than speed. The journey to Salmon City would take at least 6 hours by wagon, probably longer given the rough condition of the mountain roads. Patricia did not have 6 hours. She might not even have 3. What he needed was speed, the kind of speed that only one creature on his ranch could provide, but that creature had not been ridden in more than a year, and for good reason. Thunder was a black stallion of exceptional size and temperament, standing 17 hands high with a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian in the sunlight and eyes that burned with an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. Cade had raised Thunder from a foal, training him with patience and care, and for 5 years the stallion had been the finest horse he had ever owned, capable of covering ground at speeds that seemed impossible for an animal of such size. But then had come the incident that changed everything. A year and 2 months ago, Cade had lent Thunder to his younger brother Daniel for a journey to Boise City. Daniel had been confident in his riding ability, perhaps too confident, and when a rattlesnake had startled the stallion on a narrow mountain trail, Daniel had been thrown from the saddle and had fallen 30 feet down a rocky slope to his death. The accident had not been Thunder's fault. Any horse would have reacted to a snake striking at its legs. But Cade had been unable to look at the stallion without seeing his brother's broken body being carried back to the ranch wrapped in a canvas tarp. He had turned Thunder out to pasture and had not ridden him since, had barely been able to approach the animal without feeling grief rise up in his throat like bile. But now Patricia was dying, and Thunder was the only hope of getting her to Doc Harrison in time. Cade pressed Patricia's hand to his lips, feeling how cold her skin had become, how weak her pulse beat against his thumb. "Hold on," he whispered to her, even though she could not hear him. "Just hold on for me, Patricia. I am going to get you help. I promise you that." He left her side reluctantly and ran out to the pasture where Thunder grazed among the other horses. The stallion lifted his massive head as Cade approached, his ears pricking forward with interest. It had been so long since his master had come to him with purpose, rather than just to bring feed or water. Cade stopped at the fence and whistled the old signal he had taught Thunder years ago, the 3-note call that meant it was time to work. For a moment, the stallion just stared at him, and Cade wondered if Thunder had forgotten, if too much time had passed and the bond between them had been irreparably broken by grief and neglect. Then Thunder began to move toward him, first at a walk and then at a trot that quickly became a canter, his powerful legs eating up the distance until he stood before Cade with his head extended, his soft nose touching Cade's outstretched hand in the greeting they had shared 1,000 times before. Relief flooded through Cade with such force that his knees nearly buckled, and he pressed his forehead against Thunder's face, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and grass and sun-warmed hide. "I need you, boy," Cade said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I have not been fair to you this past year. I know I blamed you for something that was not your fault. But there is a woman dying in that house, and she is the most important thing in my world, and I need you to run faster than you have ever run before. Will you do that for me?" Thunder snorted softly and pushed his head more firmly against Cade's chest, and Cade chose to interpret that as agreement. He fetched the saddle and bridle from the tack room in the barn, equipment that had not been used in more than a year but which he had kept oiled and ready out of habit. His hands shook as he saddled Thunder himself, taking care to ensure that every strap was secure and every buckle properly fastened, because he could not afford for anything to go wrong during the desperate ride ahead. Thunder stood patient and still throughout the process, as though he understood the gravity of the situation, and when Cade led him to the house and tied him to the porch rail, the stallion remained calm and ready. Cade went back inside to find Patricia's condition unchanged, which he supposed was better than finding her worse or gone entirely. He wrapped her in blankets despite the heat of the day, knowing that shock and blood loss would make her cold. Then he carefully lifted her into his arms again and carried her outside. Getting her onto Thunder proved to be the most challenging part of the entire endeavor, because she was dead weight and he had to mount first and then have her lifted up to him, which meant improvising a series of ropes and pulleys using the porch beam, until he finally managed to settle her in front of him on the saddle, her back against his chest and his arms around her to hold her secure while also gripping the reins. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Cade finally urged Thunder into motion. The stallion started with a smooth walk that quickly transitioned into his ground-eating trot, and then into the powerful canter that Cade remembered so well. The ranch fell away behind them as they headed north along the rough road that would eventually lead them to Salmon City. Patricia's head lolled against Cade's shoulder, and he could feel the dampness of her blood seeping through the blankets and onto his shirt, could feel the weakening rhythm of her heart beating against his arm where he held her. "Stay with me," he murmured into her hair as Thunder's hooves drummed against the hard, packed earth. "Please stay with me, Patricia. There is so much I need to tell you, so many things I should have said before now. Just stay alive long enough for me to say them." The road climbed into the mountains, winding through stands of pine and aspen that cast long shadows across their path. Thunder maintained his pace with the steady determination of a horse who understood his mission, never faltering even when the road became steep or rocky. Cade had forgotten what it felt like to ride this magnificent animal, had forgotten the sense of power and connection that came from being mounted on a horse of such exceptional quality. Thunder responded to the slightest pressure of his legs or shift of his weight, adjusting his gait to accommodate the uneven terrain without any need for guidance from the reins. This was partnership at its finest, human and horse working together toward a common goal with absolute trust in one another. But even Thunder's remarkable speed could not make the miles disappear as quickly as Cade needed them to. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Cade too much of blood, and Patricia's breathing grew increasingly shallow. He checked her pulse frequently, pressing his fingers against the cold skin of her neck and counting the faint beats that came too far apart. Each time he checked, he feared he would find nothing, that her heart had finally given up the fight, but each time he felt that weak flutter of life still persisting. They passed through a valley where a small creek ran alongside the road, and Cade stopped long enough to let Thunder drink and to wet a cloth that he used to moisten Patricia's lips. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, and she looked up at him with confusion and pain darkening her brown eyes. "Cade," her voice was barely a whisper, so faint he almost missed it over the sound of the running water. "I am here," he said, relief making his own voice unsteady. "I am taking you to the doctor in Salmon City. You are going to be all right, Patricia. You have to be all right." "What happened?" she asked, her words slurring together slightly. "I feel so cold." "I do not know what happened," he admitted. "I found you collapsed by the water trough. You have been bleeding, but Doc Harrison will know how to help you. We are almost there." That was a lie. They were not almost there. They still had more than 15 miles to cover and darkness was coming fast. But he could not tell her the truth, could not let her see the fear that gripped him like a vise around his heart. "I am sorry," she whispered, and her eyes closed again. "Sorry." He stared down at her pale face, illuminated by the dying light. "What do you have to be sorry for?" But she had already slipped back into unconsciousness, and no amount of gentle calling could bring her back. Cade remounted Thunder with her in his arms and pushed the stallion back into motion, faster now, faster than was probably safe given the fading light and the rough road, but he was past the point of caring about safety. All that mattered was getting Patricia to help before it was too late. Full darkness had fallen by the time they reached the outskirts of Salmon City, and Cade navigated by memory, and by the lights beginning to appear in windows along the town's main street. Thunder's coat was dark with sweat, and his breathing came hard, but the stallion had never once faltered or tried to slow despite the punishing pace Cade had demanded of him. Doc Harrison's house sat at the far end of town, a white clapboard building with a painted sign hanging from the porch that announced his profession to anyone who needed his services. Cade brought Thunder to a sliding stop in front of the house and began shouting for the doctor even before he had fully dismounted. Lights appeared in the windows, and within moments, Doc Harrison emerged onto the porch, a portly man in his 60s with silver hair and shrewd blue eyes that had seen just about every ailment and injury the Idaho territory could produce. "Who is it?" The doctor called out, hurrying down the steps toward where Cade stood with Patricia in his arms. "Patricia Coleman," Cade said quickly. "She is bleeding badly, has been for hours. I do not know what is wrong with her, but she is dying, Doc. You have to help her." Doc Harrison took one look at Patricia's pale face and the blood-soaked blankets and immediately gestured toward his door. "Bring her inside quickly. Put her on the examination table in the back room. How long has she been like this?" "I found her collapsed around 3 this afternoon," Cade said as he followed the doctor into the house and through to the small surgery at the rear. "I came as fast as I could. On that horse." Doc Harrison glanced out the window to where Thunder stood heaving in the yard. "You rode all the way from Challies on that animal in under 5 hours. I did not have a choice. She was dying." "Is dying," the doctor corrected grimly as he began cutting away Patricia's ruined dress to expose the source of the bleeding. "This is a miscarriage, Cade. She was pregnant, and something went wrong. The question now is whether I can stop the hemorrhaging before she bleeds out entirely." Cade felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath his feet. Pregnant. Patricia had been pregnant. She had never said anything to him about being with child, had never shown any signs that he had noticed, though admittedly he knew little about such matters. Had she even known herself, or had this been as much a surprise to her as it was to him? Was it her husband's? He asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. "Before he died?" "I have no idea," Doc Harrison said as he worked with swift efficiency, his hands steady despite the severity of the situation. "But right now that does not matter. What matters is stopping this bleeding and saving her life." "You need to leave the room, Cade. This is not something you want to see." Cade wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying by Patricia's side, but he recognized the wisdom in the doctor's words. He would only be in the way, and his presence might distract Doc Harrison from the delicate work that needed to be done. So he retreated to the front parlor and sank into a chair by the cold fireplace, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear, and the after-effects of the adrenaline that had sustained him through the desperate ride. Thunder still stood in the yard, and Cade forced himself to get up and go back outside to tend to the horse who had saved Patricia's life, if indeed it could be saved. He led Thunder around to the small stable behind Doc Harrison's house, and spent the next half-hour cooling the stallion down properly, walking him until his breathing returned to normal, and then rubbing him down with dry cloths and making sure he had water and feed. Thunder deserved far better than to be ridden nearly to death and then abandoned, and Cade owed the horse more than he could ever repay. "Thank you," Cade said quietly as he ran his hands one final time over Thunder's muscled neck. "Thank you for not giving up, for trusting me again after I turned my back on you. Daniel would be proud of what you did tonight. I am proud of what you did tonight." Thunder nickered softly and nuzzled Cade's chest, and for the first time since his brother's death, Cade felt some of the grief that had weighed on him begin to lift. He had blamed Thunder for an accident that had not been the stallion's fault, had let his pain cloud his judgment and damage a relationship that had been one of the best things in his life. But tonight, Thunder had proven his worth and his loyalty beyond any shadow of doubt, and Cade made a silent promise to himself that he would never again let his grief come between him and this extraordinary horse. When he returned to the house, he found Doc Harrison washing his hands in a basin, his sleeves rolled up and his expression impossible to read. Cade's heart seized in his chest, and he gripped the doorframe to steady himself. "Is she?" He could not finish the question. "She is alive," Doc Harrison said, and the relief that flooded through Cade was so powerful that his knees actually did buckle this time, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. "The bleeding has stopped, and her vital signs are stabilizing. She lost a dangerous amount of blood, but she is young and strong, and if infection does not set in, she should make a full recovery." "Can I see her?" "Not tonight. She needs rest, and frankly, so do you. You look like death itself, Cade. When was the last time you slept or ate?" Cade tried to remember and could not. Time had become meaningless from the moment he found Patricia bleeding in his yard. "I am not hungry, and I cannot sleep until I see that she is truly all right." Doc Harrison sighed but nodded. 5 minutes. That is all I am allowing. She is still unconscious and will likely remain so until morning, but you can sit with her for 5 minutes. Then you are going to eat the food my wife prepares for you, and you are going to sleep in the guest room upstairs. Those are my conditions, non-negotiable." Cade agreed without argument, and followed the doctor back to the surgery where Patricia lay on the examination table, now covered with clean white sheets, and looking impossibly small and fragile in the lamplight. Her face was still pale, but some of the deathly gray tinge had faded, and when Cade took her hand in his, he could feel that her skin was warmer than it had been during the ride. He sank into the chair beside the table and simply watched her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest as though it were precious treasure. "I thought I was going to lose you," he whispered, knowing she could not hear but needing to say the words anyway. "I thought I would never get the chance to tell you what you mean to me, how much I have come to love you these past months. I know you are still mourning your husband, and I know I have no right to burden you with my feelings, but if you can hear me somewhere in your dreams, I need you to know that you have become the most important person in my world. Losing you would break something in me that could never be repaired." Patricia's eyelids fluttered but did not open, and her fingers remained limp in his grasp. Cade lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, then carefully laid her hand back on the bed and forced himself to leave the room before Doc Harrison had to physically remove him. Mrs. Harrison proved to be a round, kindly woman who clucked over Cade like a mother hen, and insisted he eat 2 bowls of thick beef stew and half a loaf of fresh bread before she would allow him to even think about sleeping. The food sat heavy in his stomach, but he recognized that he needed the nourishment, that he had pushed his body to its limits during the desperate ride to Salmon City, and could not afford to collapse now when Patricia might need him. After eating, he submitted to being led upstairs to a small guest room with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked the main street of town. He did not expect to sleep, but exhaustion claimed him the moment his head touched the pillow, and he fell into a deep and dreamless darkness that lasted until the first light of dawn crept through the window. He woke with a start, momentarily disoriented, and then memory came flooding back and he was on his feet and heading downstairs before he was fully awake, desperate to check on Patricia's condition. He found Doc Harrison already in the surgery, checking Patricia's pulse and temperature with the calm efficiency of a man who had performed these tasks thousands of times. The doctor looked up as Cade entered and offered a small smile. "Her fever is minimal, which is a good sign," Doc Harrison said. "The risk of infection is still present, but so far she seems to be fighting it off. She woke briefly about an hour ago, asked where she was, and then fell back asleep. I expect she will wake more fully within the next few hours." "Did she say anything else?" Cade asked. "Did she ask about what happened?" "She seemed confused and weak, but that is to be expected given what her body has been through." I told her she had suffered a miscarriage and that she was in Salmon City recovering. I did not mention how she got here or how close she came to dying. I thought it best to let her regain some strength before burdening her with those details. Cade nodded, accepting the doctor's judgment. May I sit with her? Yes, but try not to disturb her rest. The more she sleeps, the faster she will heal. Cade resumed his position in the chair beside the examination table and settled in to wait. The hours passed slowly, marked by the changing angle of the sunlight streaming through the surgery window and the distant sounds of the town coming to life outside. Mrs. Harrison brought him coffee and biscuits for breakfast, and Doc Harrison checked on Patricia every hour. But otherwise, Cade was left alone with his thoughts and his fears, and the woman he loved lying unconscious before him. It was nearly noon when Patricia finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly and focusing with obvious difficulty on the unfamiliar ceiling above her. Cade leaned forward immediately, his heart rate accelerating, and when her gaze shifted to find his face, he saw recognition and confusion war in her expression. Cade. Her voice was hoarse and weak, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Where am I? What happened? You are in Salmon City at Doc Harrison's place, Cade said gently. You collapsed yesterday at the ranch. You were bleeding badly, and I brought you here for help. She frowned, clearly trying to piece together memories that remained fragmented and unclear. I remember feeling dizzy and going outside for air. Then there was pain, terrible pain, and then nothing. How long have I been here? Since last night. The doctor says you suffered a miscarriage. Were you aware that you were pregnant, Patricia? The expression that crossed her face was complicated, a mixture of sorrow and shame and something that might have been relief. I suspected, she whispered, turning her face away from him. I have missed my courses for 3 months now, and I have been feeling ill in the mornings. But I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was wrong. Was the child your husband's? The question came out more harshly than Cade intended, born of the fear and jealousy that had been gnawing at him since Doc Harrison revealed the truth of Patricia's condition. Yes. She said the word firmly, still not looking at him. Thomas died in January. This would have been his child, a final piece of him left behind in this world. But now that is gone too, and I have nothing left of him at all. Cade felt his chest tighten with a complex mixture of emotions he could not fully name. Relief that the child had not been another man's. Guilt for feeling relieved when Patricia was clearly grieving, and beneath it all a love so profound it terrified him. He reached out and gently turned her face back toward him, needing her to see his eyes and understand the truth written there. You almost died, he said quietly. When I found you yesterday, you had lost so much blood that I thought you were already gone. I have never been so frightened in my entire life as I was during the ride here, holding you and feeling your life slipping away with every mile we covered. Tears began to slide down Patricia's cheeks, cutting pale tracks through the remnants of dust and dried sweat on her skin. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry, Cade. I should have told you I suspected I was pregnant. I should have prepared you, should have made arrangements to leave your employment before this happened. I have brought nothing but trouble to your doorstep. Stop, Cade said, his voice rough with emotion. Stop apologizing for things that are not your fault. You did not choose to lose your husband, and you did not choose to lose his child, and you certainly did not choose to nearly die in my yard. None of this is your fault, Patricia, and I will not have you take blame for circumstances beyond your control. But you went to so much trouble to save me, she said, her voice breaking. You rode all night to bring me here, put yourself in danger for my sake. Why would you do that? I am just your housekeeper, a woman you hired out of pity because I had nowhere else to go. This was the moment. This was the moment when Cade could either speak the truth that had been burning in his heart for months, or he could retreat into the safety of lies and pretense, and lose any chance he might have at happiness. He thought of Thunder standing ready in the yard yesterday, thought of the trust the stallion had shown by allowing Cade to saddle him after a year of neglect, thought of the courage it took to bridge a gap created by grief and fear. If a horse could be that brave, surely a man could find the strength to speak words that might change everything. "You are not just my housekeeper," Cade said, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke him. "You have not been just my housekeeper for a long time now, if you ever were. I rode through the night because the thought of losing you was unbearable, because you have become the most important person in my world, because I am in love with you, Patricia Coleman, and I have been for months now." Patricia stared at him with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open in shock. For a long moment she said nothing, and Cade felt his heart sink as he realized he had made a terrible mistake, that he had burdened her with feelings she could not possibly return, not when she was still mourning her husband and recovering from losing his child. "You love me," she finally whispered, and her voice was full of wonder rather than the rejection he had been expecting. "I do," Cade said simply. "I know the timing is terrible, and I know you are still grieving Thomas and the child you lost, and I am not asking you to return my feelings or to make any decisions right now. I just needed you to know the truth, needed you to understand why I did what I did yesterday. You are not a burden or an obligation, Patricia. You are precious to me, and I would ride through fire to keep you safe." More tears spilled down her cheeks, and Cade felt panic rise in his chest, certain that he had hurt her with his ill-timed confession. But then she reached out and took his hand in both of hers, gripping it with surprising strength for someone who had been at death's door less than 24 hours ago. "I love Thomas," she said quietly. "He was a good man, and he deserved better than to die alone in a mine collapse far from home. I grieved him deeply, and part of me will always carry that grief. But it has been more than half a year since his death, and these past 3 months living at your ranch have shown me that life continues even after loss, that it is possible to feel joy and hope again, even when you thought those feelings had died along with the person you lost." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I have fallen in love with you too, Cade Mallory. I have tried to tell myself that it was too soon and that you could not possibly feel the same way about a widow with nothing to offer but a talent for cooking and cleaning. But every morning when I saw you come in from the barn with that soft smile you reserved just for me, every evening when we sat together and watched the sunset paint the mountains purple, I fell a little more in love with you. I have been terrified to tell you, terrified that you would reject me, or that I was betraying Thomas's memory by allowing myself to care for another man." Relief and joy flooded through Cade with such force that he actually laughed, a sound of pure happiness that seemed to fill the small surgery and chase away the lingering shadows of fear and grief. He lifted Patricia's hand to his lips and kissed it with infinite gentleness, mindful of her weakened state, but unable to resist the need to express physically the emotions that overwhelmed him. "You are not betraying anyone," he said firmly. "Thomas would want you to be happy, to find love again and build a new life. And I promise you, Patricia, I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret giving me your heart. Every day of the rest of your life." She asked, and now there was a hint of teasing in her voice despite her tears. "That is quite a commitment, Cade Mallory. Are you certain you know what you are getting yourself into?" "Absolutely certain," he said without hesitation. "In fact, once you are recovered enough to stand without fainting, I intend to take you before a preacher and make you my wife if you will have me. I know it is fast, and I know people will talk, but I have already wasted months hiding my feelings from you, and I will not waste another day. I want you to be my wife, Patricia. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you when the time is right, and you are ready. Grow old watching the Idaho mountains change with the seasons. Will you marry me? Patricia was crying in earnest now, but Cade could see that these were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. Yes, she said through her tears. Yes, I will marry you, Cade. Nothing would make me happier than to be your wife. They sat there holding hands and grinning at each other like fools, until Doc Harrison came in to check on his patient, and found them both weeping and laughing in equal measure. The doctor shook his head with amusement, and declared that whatever had transpired in his absence was clearly better medicine than anything he could prescribe. He examined Patricia thoroughly, and pronounced her recovery progressing better than expected, though he insisted she remain in Salmon City for at least a week to ensure no infection developed, and to give her body time to heal before attempting the journey back to Challies. Cade sent word back to his ranch via a boy heading south with a wagon train, letting his hired hands know that he would be away for at least another week, and that they should continue with their regular duties in his absence. Then he settled into life in Salmon City, with the single-minded focus of a man whose entire world had narrowed to the woman recovering in Doc Harrison's surgery. He sat with Patricia for hours every day, talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their future. He learned that she had always wanted children, at least 3 but preferably more, and that she loved music even though she could not carry a tune to save her life. She learned that he had always been more comfortable with horses than people, that he still had nightmares about finding Daniel's broken body, and that his favorite meal was apple pie with cinnamon, which she promised to bake for him every week once they were married. On the 3rd day of her recovery, when Patricia was strong enough to sit up and take short walks around the house, Cade went to visit Thunder in Doc Harrison's stable. The stallion had been well cared for in Cade's absence, but the horse clearly recognized his master and greeted him with obvious pleasure, pushing his massive head against Cade's chest and nickering with contentment. "You saved her life," Cade said softly, running his hands through Thunder's glossy black mane. "You carried us both through darkness and over rough roads, and you never once hesitated or gave up. I owe you more than I can ever repay, my friend. When we return home, you will have the finest pasture and the best feed and all the mares your heart desires. You have more than earned your rest." Thunder seemed to understand, or perhaps Cade just imagined the intelligence in those dark eyes. Either way, he spent an hour grooming the stallion until his coat shone like polished stone, and his mane and tail hung like silk. It felt good to work with his hands again, to engage in the familiar routine of caring for a horse, and it gave him time to think about the future that stretched before him, full of promise and possibility. On the 6th day of their stay in Salmon City, Patricia was declared well enough to leave Doc Harrison's care, though the doctor cautioned that she should avoid strenuous activity for at least another month, and that she should expect her recovery to take time. Cade paid the doctor's fee gladly, adding a generous bonus that Doc Harrison initially tried to refuse, until Cade insisted, pointing out that the man had saved the life of the woman he loved, and that no amount of money could truly compensate for such a gift. Before leaving town, Cade and Patricia walked together to the small white church that sat on a hill overlooking Salmon City. The preacher was a thin man in his 40s with kind eyes and a booming voice that seemed too large for his slight frame. He listened as Cade explained their situation, their desire to be married before returning to Challies, and he agreed without hesitation to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. They were married with Doc Harrison and his wife as witnesses, Patricia wearing a simple blue dress that Mrs. Harrison had lent her, and Cade in his cleanest shirt and trousers, his hair still damp from the bath he had taken at the town's bathhouse. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the preacher declared them husband and wife and told Cade he could kiss his bride, Cade felt as though his heart might burst from sheer joy. He kissed Patricia gently, mindful of her still fragile health, and tasted salt from the tears running down both their faces. They spent their wedding night in a room at the town's single boarding house, and though Patricia was not yet well enough for anything more than gentle caresses and soft words whispered in the darkness, Cade had never felt more content or complete. He held his new wife in his arms and listened to her breathing even out as she fell asleep, and he made silent promises to whatever gods might be listening that he would cherish this woman for all the days of his life, that he would protect her and provide for her, and never give her reason to regret her choice to marry him. The journey back to Challies took 2 days rather than the 5 hours Thunder had needed to cover the distance in the opposite direction. Cade had purchased a gentle mare for Patricia to ride, and they traveled at an easy pace with frequent stops to rest and water the horses. Thunder seemed content to amble along beside them, no longer required to push himself to the edge of his endurance, and Cade caught himself watching the stallion with profound gratitude and affection. The bond that had been damaged by grief and blame had been restored and even strengthened by the desperate ride that saved Patricia's life, and Cade knew he would never again doubt the stallion's loyalty or courage. They arrived at the ranch on a golden afternoon with the September sun slanting across the mountains, and the air carrying the first hint of the autumn that would soon transform the landscape. Cade's hired hands came out to greet them with obvious curiosity, having heard only that there had been a medical emergency and that Cade would be away for an extended period. Their surprise at discovering that Cade had returned with a wife was evident, but they were all polite and welcoming, offering congratulations and promising to do whatever they could to make Patricia feel at home. That evening, after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse and the ranch had settled into quiet, Cade and Patricia sat together on the porch and watched the familiar spectacle of the sun setting behind the mountains. Patricia leaned against his shoulder, her hand clasped in his, and Cade felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in years, perhaps not since before Daniel's death had opened a wound in his heart that he thought would never heal. "This is home," Patricia said softly. "I knew it the first time I saw this view, but it feels different now. It feels like I truly belong here, like this is where I was always meant to be." "You do belong here," Cade assured her. "This ranch, this life, it is all yours now too. We will build our future here together, raise our children in the shadow of these mountains, grow old watching these same sunsets, and every day I will thank whatever fate brought you to my door 3 months ago." 4 months ago, Patricia corrected with a smile. "I arrived in May, remember? You were trying to make dinner and nearly burned down your kitchen in the process." Cade laughed at the memory. "That is right. I had completely forgotten about the smoking pan and the ruined stew. You took one look at the disaster I had created and simply rolled up your sleeves and started cleaning while I stood there feeling like the world's biggest fool. You were charming in your helplessness," Patricia teased. "Though I admit, I wondered what kind of man could successfully run a ranch, but could not manage to boil water without supervision." "The kind of man who desperately needed a wife," Cade said, turning to face her and taking both her hands in his. "And now I have one, the best wife a man could ask for. I love you, Patricia Mallory. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too, if there is anything after this life." "I love you too," she whispered. And when he kissed her this time, there was nothing gentle or restrained about it, just pure love and desire and joy expressed through the meeting of their mouths, and the way their bodies pressed together as though trying to occupy the same space. The months that followed their marriage were the happiest of Cade's life. Patricia recovered fully from her ordeal, regaining her strength and vitality until no trace remained of how close she had come to death. She threw herself into life on the ranch with enthusiasm, not content to simply keep house, but insisting on learning to ride properly, so she could accompany Cade when he checked the herds or rode the boundaries of his property. He taught her on a gentle gelding, patient with her initial clumsiness, and proud when she quickly developed into a competent if not exceptional rider. Thunder became something of a legend in the area around Challies after word spread about the desperate midnight ride that had saved Patricia's life. Ranchers and cowboys would make excuses to stop by Cade's property, just to see the massive black stallion, who had covered 30 miles of mountain roads in less than 5 hours carrying double weight. Cade received several offers to buy Thunder, some for truly staggering amounts of money, but he refused them all without hesitation. Thunder was not for sale at any price, would never be for sale, because the stallion had given him back everything that mattered most in his life. Winter came to Idaho with heavy snows that blanketed the ranch and turned the mountains into a landscape of white and gray. Cade and Patricia spent the long dark evenings huddled by the fireplace, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about their hopes and dreams. Patricia revealed that she wanted to start a garden in the spring, that she thought they could perhaps add a room onto the house for the children she hoped they would have. And Cade found himself making plans and sketching designs with an enthusiasm he had not felt for anything in years. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, Patricia confirmed what they had both already suspected. She was pregnant again. This time, however, the pregnancy was healthy and progressed normally, and though Cade could not help but worry given what had happened with her previous pregnancy, Patricia remained strong and vibrant throughout the long months of waiting. Doc Harrison made the journey down from Salmon City 3 times to check on her, and each time he pronounced mother and child healthy and developing normally. Their son was born on a warm June evening in 1883, arriving after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours but resulted in a healthy, squalling infant with Cade's dark hair and Patricia's brown eyes. They named him Daniel Thomas, honoring both Cade's brother and Patricia's first husband, and when Cade held his son for the first time, he felt tears stream down his face as he was overwhelmed by love and gratitude and awe at the tiny life they had created together. Patricia proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even during the sleepless nights and endless demands of caring for an infant. Cade did his best to help, though he admitted freely that he was far more comfortable with horses than babies, and Patricia would often find him standing over Daniel's cradle just watching the baby sleep with an expression of such tender devotion that it made her heart ache with love for this man who had saved her life and given her a reason to keep living. When Daniel was 6 months old, Patricia announced that she was pregnant again, and though the news came sooner than they had planned, both of them were delighted. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1884, a tiny girl with Patricia's delicate features and Cade's stubborn determination. They named her Sarah, and she immediately wrapped her father around her little finger in a way that made Patricia laugh and shake her head in mock despair. The ranch prospered during these years, growing from a modest operation into one of the most successful in the region. Cade's reputation as a breeder of exceptional horses spread far and wide, and Thunder sired dozens of foals who inherited their father's speed and intelligence. Cade never rode Thunder hard again after that desperate night ride to Salmon City, treating the stallion with the reverence and respect he deserved. But Thunder seemed content with his role as lead stud and could often be found in the pasture surrounded by mares and their foals, a black king presiding over his domain. On the first anniversary of their marriage, Cade took Patricia back to Salmon City for a second honeymoon, leaving Daniel and Sarah in the care of a trusted hired hand's wife. They stayed at the boarding house where they had spent their wedding night, and Doc Harrison and his wife hosted them for dinner, reminiscing about that frantic night when Cade had arrived with Patricia dying in his arms and how miraculous it was that everything had worked out so well. "You gave me my life," Patricia said to Doc Harrison as they lingered over coffee after the meal. "I have often thought about how different things would be if Cade had not been brave enough to saddle Thunder and ride through the darkness to bring me to you. I would be dead and he would be alone and our children would never have been born. We owe you everything, Doctor." "You owe me nothing," Doc Harrison said gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I just did my job. If you want to thank someone, thank that remarkable husband of yours and that extraordinary horse he rode. They are the ones who saved your life, not me." "I thank them every day," Patricia said softly, reaching over to take Cade's hand. "Every single day." That night, lying in bed with Patricia curled against his side, Cade found himself thinking about how strange and unpredictable life could be. A year and a half ago, he had been a lonely widower still mourning his brother, existing rather than truly living, convinced that the best years of his life were behind him. Then Patricia had arrived at his ranch desperate for work, and slowly, gradually, she had thawed the ice around his heart and taught him to hope again. Her near death had forced him to confront his feelings and take risks he had been too afraid to take before. And Thunder, the horse he had blamed for his brother's death, had given him the means to save the woman he loved. Everything was connected, he realized. Daniel's death had led him to push Thunder away, but that very separation had meant Thunder was rested and ready when Patricia needed him most. Patricia's loss of her husband had brought her to Cade's ranch, and her near-fatal miscarriage had forced them both to acknowledge feelings they had been too frightened to voice. From tragedy and pain and loss had come love and family and happiness beyond anything Cade had imagined possible. As the years passed, their family grew. A second daughter arrived in 1885, followed by twin sons in 1887. The original ranch house proved too small for their expanding brood, so Cade built a larger home on a hill overlooking the property, a beautiful two-story structure with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for all their children and a few more besides. Patricia planted her garden and added a small orchard, and in summer the air was filled with the scent of growing things and the laughter of children playing in the yard. Thunder aged gracefully, his black coat eventually showing threads of silver around his muzzle, but his spirit remaining undiminished. The stallion developed a particular fondness for the Mallory children, allowing them to climb on his back and feed him apples with a patience he showed to no one else. Cade would sometimes stand at the fence and watch Thunder with the children, marveling at how gentle this powerful animal could be with the small humans who adored him. On a summer evening in 1895, when Daniel the Younger was 12 and preparing to follow in his father's footsteps as a rancher, Cade took his eldest son out to the pasture where Thunder grazed in the setting sun. The stallion was 23 years old now, ancient for a horse, and though he remained healthy, Cade could see that time was taking its inevitable toll. Thunder moved more slowly than he once had, and his eyes held a peaceful weariness that spoke of a life well lived. "This horse saved your mother's life before you were born," Cade told his son, running his hand along Thunder's neck. "I rode him from here to Salmon City in less than 5 hours, through darkness and over dangerous roads, and he never faltered once. He is the bravest, most loyal creature I have ever known, and everything good in our lives exists because of what he did that night." Young Daniel listened intently, his face serious as he absorbed his father's words. "Will you tell me the whole story?" he asked. "Mother has mentioned it, but she always gets emotional and has to stop." So Cade told his son the complete tale, starting with finding Patricia collapsed in the yard and ending with their marriage in Salmon City. He spoke of his fear during the ride, of the way Thunder had responded to the crisis with courage and determination, of the terrible hours waiting to learn if Patricia would survive. Young Daniel listened with wide eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch Thunder's shoulder as though to thank the horse for the gift he had given. "I understand now why you have always treated Thunder differently from the other horses," Daniel said when his father finished speaking. "He is not just a horse, he is family." "Exactly," Cade agreed, feeling pride swell in his chest at his son's understanding. "He is family, and he always will be." Thunder died peacefully in his sleep that winter, passing away during a cold December night without pain or struggle. Cade found him in the morning lying in his favorite spot near the barn, and though he had known this day would eventually come, the grief that struck him was profound. They buried Thunder on the hill behind the new house, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his life. The entire family gathered for the burial, even the youngest children somehow understanding that this was an important moment, a time to honor the extraordinary animal who had shaped their lives in ways both large and small. Patricia stood beside Cade with tears streaming down her face, holding his hand as they said goodbye to the horse who had carried them both to safety on that desperate night 13 years ago. "He gave me you," she whispered. "He gave me our children and our life together. I will never forget what he did for us." "None of us will," Cade said, his voice rough with grief. "His legacy lives on in every foal he sired, in every member of our family who exists, because he found the courage to run through darkness when I needed him most. He will never be forgotten, Patricia. I promise you that." Life continued after Thunder's death, as it always does, but something had changed in Cade. He found himself thinking more often about legacy and memory, about the stories we leave behind when we are gone. He began writing down the tale of that midnight ride, wanting to preserve every detail so that future generations of Mallorys would know the truth of how their family had been saved by the courage of a remarkable horse. The children grew and married, and began having children of their own. Daniel the younger took over management of the ranch, proving himself every bit as skilled as his father. Sarah married a lawyer from Boise and moved to the city, though she returned often with her children to visit the ranch where she had been born. The other children scattered across Idaho and beyond, building lives of their own but always maintaining ties to the land where they had grown up. Cade and Patricia grew old together, their hair turning white and their bodies growing frail, but their love never dimmed. Every evening they would sit on the porch of the big house and watch the sun set behind the mountains. And every evening Cade would take Patricia's hand and tell her that he loved her, that marrying her had been the best decision he had ever made. And every evening Patricia would smile and say that she felt exactly the same way. On a spring morning in 1912, Cade woke to find Patricia had passed away in her sleep, her face peaceful and her hand still clasped in his. The grief that struck him was like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his heart stutter in his chest. For 30 years they had been partners, lovers, best friends, and now suddenly he was alone in a way he had not been since before that summer day when he found her bleeding in his yard and made the desperate choice to saddle Thunder and ride for help. He buried her on the hill beside Thunder, feeling that it was only fitting that the woman and the horse who had meant everything to him should rest together. The entire family gathered for the funeral, children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, 3 generations of Mallorys who owed their existence to the love between Cade and Patricia, and to the courage of a black stallion who had run through darkness to save a life. Cade lived for 2 more years after Patricia's death. Years he spent mostly sitting on the porch and staring at the mountains while his mind wandered through memories of a life well lived. His children worried about him and tried to convince him to move into town or to live with one of them, but he refused, insisting that he wanted to remain on the land where he had built his life with Patricia, where every tree and rock and building held some memory of their time together. He died peacefully in his sleep on a summer night in 1914, and his children buried him beside Patricia and Thunder on the hill, 3 souls who had been bound together by love and sacrifice and the kind of loyalty that transcends death itself. They marked his grave with a stone that bore his name and the dates of his life, and beneath that they added a single line that Cade himself had written in the manuscript he left behind. He saddled his best horse and rode through darkness for love. The ranch continued to operate for another 40 years before being sold to a developer who turned it into a small town. But the hill where Cade and Patricia and Thunder were buried was preserved as a park, and the 3 graves remained undisturbed, watched over by the mountains that had witnessed their story. Visitors to the park would sometimes stop to read the headstones, and some would leave flowers or small stones as tokens of respect, moved by the simple epitaph that hinted at a story of courage and love and devotion. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the light turned golden and the air carried the scent of growing things, people swore they could see 3 figures on the hill, a man and a woman walking hand in hand, accompanied by a massive black horse who moved with the easy grace of youth restored. They would walk together as the sun set, 3 spirits forever bound by the choices made on a desperate August night in 1882, when a cowboy saddled his best horse for the first time in a year and rode through darkness to save the life of the woman he loved. The story became legend in Idaho, passed down through generations, until no one could say for certain anymore where truth ended and embellishment began. But the heart of the story remained unchanged. A man, a woman, and a horse, 3 souls connected by bonds stronger than death, whose love for each other had created a legacy that endured long after their bodies had returned to the earth. And in the end, perhaps that is the only kind of immortality that truly matters, not the preservation of flesh and bone, but the preservation of love and memory, and the knowledge that we were here, that we mattered, that our choices and our courage changed the world in ways both large and small. The Mallory descendants continued to thrive throughout Idaho and beyond, successful ranchers and business people and artists and teachers, each carrying within them some spark of the determination and loyalty that had defined Cade and Patricia's love. And whenever they gathered for reunions or holidays, someone would inevitably tell the story again, the tale of how their great-great-grandfather had saddled Thunder and ridden through the night, of how Patricia had almost died, and then had lived to bear 5 children and build a life that encompassed more joy than she had ever imagined possible. The story was a reminder that love requires courage, that sometimes the greatest acts of devotion happen in moments of crisis when we are forced to set aside our fears and simply act. It was a reminder that the bonds between human and animal can be as profound as the bonds between human and human, that loyalty and trust transcend species and create connections that endure beyond death. And most importantly, it was a reminder that life can surprise us, that from tragedy and loss can come joy and healing, that it is never too late to open our hearts and allow ourselves to hope again. In 1982, exactly 100 years after Cade's desperate ride, the state of Idaho erected a historical marker near the spot where the original Mallory Ranch had stood. The marker told the story of Cade and Patricia and Thunder, preserving their tale for future generations and ensuring that their courage and love would not be forgotten. Historians researched the records and confirmed the basic facts: that Cade Mallory had indeed owned a ranch near Challies, that he had married Patricia Coleman in Salmon City in 1882, that they had raised 5 children together and lived long, productive lives. The rest, the details and emotions and intimate moments, those could only be inferred from the manuscript Cade had left behind and from the oral tradition passed down through the Mallory family. But whether every detail was precisely accurate mattered less than the emotional truth at the story's core. That love is worth fighting for, that courage can be found in the darkest moments, and that the choices we make in times of crisis define who we are and who we will become. Cade chose to saddle Thunder despite his fear and grief, chose to ride through darkness despite the danger, chose to open his heart to love despite the risk of loss. And those choices made all the difference, not just for him but for the generations that followed, for the family that would never have existed without his courage and Thunder's speed and Patricia's strength. The story of that midnight ride became a legend, yes, but it was also something more. It was a testimony to the power of love to transform lives and create legacies that endure long after the original actors have passed from the stage. It was a reminder that we are all capable of extraordinary acts when we are motivated by love, that there is no obstacle too great to overcome when someone we cherish needs us, that the bonds we form with each other and with the animals who share our lives can give us strength we never knew we possessed. And so the legend persists, told and retold, changing slightly with each generation but always maintaining its essential truth. A cowboy, a horse, and a woman, a desperate ride through darkness, a love that conquered death and grief and fear to build something beautiful and lasting. 3 souls connected by bonds that transcended the ordinary, whose story reminds us that we are all capable of courage, that we are all capable of love, and that sometimes the greatest adventures of our lives begin with a single desperate choice made in a moment when everything we value hangs in the balance. The sun sets behind the Idaho mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, the same colors Cade and Patricia watched together for 30 years. The wind whispers through the grass on the hill where 3 graves stand side by side, and if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of hoofbeats drumming against hard earth, the sound of a great black horse running through darkness, carrying 2 souls toward their destiny and their future and their happily ever after.